Okay, good evening to you all, and welcome to this evening's webinar in the latest of IAA Hyderabad chapter series of learning programs. I am T.N. Menon, the president of IAA Hyderabad chapter. The title of today's session is obviously borrowed from the popular saying, well begun is half done. As auditors, the importance of planning in not only audit engagements, but in everything we do, we don't need to be reminded. In these days of remote working, we have learned that many of the things we do during field work can as well be done remotely. That's where a well-planned engagement with a comprehensive preliminary survey and in-depth risk assessment based on the information gathered can be a powerful tool for the auditor to significantly minimize the time required for the field work, which we all know that something which consumes a lot of resources, especially for organizations having overseas locations, and provide them with sharper focus. We have a panel of two experienced and accomplished auditors this evening, Sunil Rao and Tinku Padia. Let me give a brief introduction of Sunil and Tinku. Sunil, the current Vice President of IAA Hyderabad chapter, is a chartered accountant by profession. He is a managing director with Productivity India, a member private limited, based out of Hyderabad. Sunil has close to 17 years of post-qualification experience. May I request the audience to please mute your mics, please? He's based out of Hyderabad. Sunil has close to 17 years of post-qualification experience in a wide spectrum of areas such as risk-based internal operational and process audits, SOX, ICO4 readiness, managing shared service centers, and risk assessment for clients across various industries. Sunil manages several global SOX programs for Productivity. Tinku Padia, the secretary of IAA Hyderabad chapter, is a chartered accountant, certified internal auditor, certified fraud examiner, and certified SOX expert by qualification with 16 years of professional experience. He is currently the Director Internal Audit and SOX at Dr. Reddy's and leads the internal audit vertical, managing domestic as well as international audits across various geographies. Working with DRL since the last 10 years, Tinku has been recognized for excellence and high commitment in the company. Prior to DRL, he had worked with Ernst & Young, HSBC, and ACC Cement in various roles of audits and finance. He is also a member of the ACFE Hyderabad chapter. With that said, I'm sure you will find the session quite informative and helpful to sharpen your skills. The presentation is going to be for about 45 to 50 minutes, followed by a Q&A session for about 10 to 15 minutes. Please feel free to key in your questions to the panelists through the chat box. They will be answered at the end of the session. Thank you, and over to the panelists.
Yeah, thank you, Menon sir, for your kind words and setting the context. So, hello and greetings to everyone. Sunil and myself would like to extend a warm welcome to all the participants. And let me start with a question: why an audit engagement planning is required? So, there is a Japanese proverb which says, "Vision without an action is a daydream. An action without a vision is a nightmare." As we are aware, the internal audit plays an important role in evaluating and improving the effectiveness of risk management, control, and governance process. A well-planned engagement will help internal auditor in discharging their duties effectively. So the two important aspects it addresses are, firstly, the prioritization of risk. It helps us to focus our efforts on high or critical areas of the business or process to be reviewed. Secondly, it helps us in proper allocation of resources. An ineffective planning can defeat the very purpose of the IF function, since it's an indirect tool helping to achieve the goal of an IA function. So with this background, we will move to the next slide, please. So this is the broad agenda for the today's session, which will be covered by both myself and Sunil. Not dwelling much on this. Sunil will move to the next slide, please. Yeah, thank you. So these slides talks about the internal audit activity or a function as a whole at a broader perspective, and how do we balance the same when we engage in audit planning. As per IIS standard 2000, the chief audit executive must effectively manage internal activity to ensure it adds value to the organization. So what are the major IA activities with respect to audit engagement? So broadly, there are four activities that includes. First is the planning and audit. Secondly, conducting a field work. Third is the reporting, and fourth is the follow-up. Now we will see how, with respect to planning and engagement, how performance standards 2201 states that we should consider the objective of the activity being reviewed. That is nothing but the goals, KRAs, and KPI of the activity. We should take into account the scorecard of the activity, and the efficiency and effectiveness of the activity relates to the achievement of the goal of the activity in an effective manner. That is the first thing, the objective of the activity being reviewed. Now, secondly, we should take into account the significant risk related to that activity, operations, and resources into account. Third is the adequation and effectiveness of the activity governance, risk management, control processes, and also the opportunities to make significant improvement to the same. Last but not the least, we need to take into account the emerging issues or trend that will impact the organization. So let me give an example. For example, increase in unauthorized access to different applications due to work from home concept, and a possibility of leakage of research data from an R&D employee working from home. Sunil, you want to add something here?
No, I think you've covered Tinku. We'll get to
it. Okay. Next slide, please. Okay, from an IIA standard perspective, these are the key ingredients required for developing an effective engagement plan. The performance standard 2200 is a Bible, and that provides us a guidance towards the same. So in our company, we follow a concept of planning document, which is mandatory for all the audits, which covers the key aspects of the engagement. I'll draw an inference to the same while discussing the key steps of the engagement planning. The first step is understanding the purpose and context of the engagement. So there are different types of engagement. First is like the assurance services, whether it's an assurance service. It requires an objective examination of evidences from an independent perspective. Or if it's a consulting service, here the auditor is no longer an independent, but is able to advise and assist in the implementation of new business process. The next step is about understanding the expectation of the stakeholders. After the audit initiation mail has been issued, generally the team collects preliminary information about the business. It processes who are the key stakeholders, the financial data, which will help us to understand the financial performance, and prior audit reports. What we do, we also meet the senior stakeholder of the concerned business to understand the key risk, any inputs, or areas or processes which they feel risk is high or needs to be covered in depth in our engagement. So the understanding of business and its process by interacting with the process is critical in the engagement planning. The next step in the process is the preliminary risk assessment. So based on the input from the stakeholders, key stakeholders, analytical procedures, the interviews, and prior audit reports, so we develop what are the key areas or significant areas to be focused in the review. So sometimes what we can do is that we conduct, in fact, surveys with the stakeholders to find out what is going well and what are the concern areas. So, for example, what we did, we conducted a survey with the stakeholders while conducting a review of joining and separation process in our HR audit. So this really helped us in knowing what are the issues on the ground, what are the key risk area from the user point of view, from the key stakeholder point of view. So all this information which we discussed are captured in the planning document. So planning documents forms a very important document which will capture all the key information of the engagement planning, and it acts as a tool which will guide us the whole engagement in terms of conducting the field work and right from end to end in terms of closing the engagement. Okay, so the next step, moving towards the next step, the auditor has to define the objective of the engagement. So this is the critical part. You will see once you define the objective of the engagement, all other aspects will follow and will go in terms of achieving the engagement objective. So the objective should address two key things. It should address the risk associated with the activity under the audit. It should be clear about which assurance the audit will provide. So, for example, with the compliance with the company policy and procedure, determine the effectiveness of the policy, or evaluate the adequacy of the internal control. Say, for example, determine the accuracy of reports which are generated by the department. So, after you define the objective, we define the scope of the engagement. Again, while defining the scope, we should always keep in mind it should satisfy the objective of the engagement. And also very important to keep in mind, we need to carve out what is not covered, what to be not covered in our scope. So then comes the allocation of resources, which should be based on the nature and complexity of the engagement, or the skill sets, the knowledge, and the experience of the resources. For example, if you want to conduct a review of treasury operations, but you don't have the relevant skill set in your organization, then you need to bring in subject matter experts from external outside, from outside firm. Or for example, a new person has joined your function or a department, and you should conduct the audit under the supervision of the senior auditors, because that proficiency in audit has to be there. The last step in the planning, before we embark on the field work, is the audit program. The internal auditor must develop and document a work program to achieve again the engagement objective. The audit program must be detailed, it should be clear, it should have steps for identifying, evaluating, documenting the information during the engagement. Again, it should also be approved by the audit supervisor. And engagement must be properly supervised to ensure our key thing that objectives are achieved and quality is assured, and all the team which is working on the engagement should be developed. And supervision should also be at all the levels of audit activity. The extent of supervision will depend upon the experience and the proficiency of the auditor, also the complexity of the engagement. Now, the evidence of supervision has to be documented and retained. Supervisor review comments or inputs from the which inputs must also form part of audit working paper. This would also help in our quality assurance review of the function, because the external auditor would need to evaluate the same so that they can comment on the compliance on the IIA standards. Yes, Sunil. So request you to move to the next slide, please. Thank you, Sunil. So these are the few risks, key risks that should be taken into account during an engagement planning. If the same are not addressed, then we might not meet our audit objective and add value to the organization. So there are 6-7 key risks, which I'll just touch upon maybe 2-3 aspects. So for example, not addressing the significant risk of compliance to local level laws while auditing an HR process, or not evaluating the pricing area when you are looking at the sales process. Or one more example, not considering the security aspect when you are conducting the information system audit review. Secondly, maybe I'll cover the risk prioritization. So risk, after the risk identification, the risk should be prioritized based on its impact on the business. not meeting the stakeholders' expectation. So, as we discussed, during engagement planning, adequate consideration should be given to the concerns, high-risk areas, or inputs provided by the stakeholder activity. This also helps in building a strong relationship with the auditee. And most importantly, it facilitates the successful closure of the engagement. So, Sunil, we will move to the next slide, please.
Yeah, Tinku, I'd just like to add here one point. On the
Please go ahead.
ineffective governance and risk as a management control, which you see here in the point number 4, it's important to note that while all these important aspects have been covered by Tinku, I think one of the other important aspects which I would like to touch upon is this point number 4. Now, we've learned from the pandemic, there's been so much of a literature, there's so much of what to do, what not to do. Interestingly, if you look at it and reflect, a lot of us have absorbed a whole lot of tons of information of how to get back to the new normal, what will be the future like. But I think we as an organization, our respective organizations, wherever we serve, or for our clients, we'll have to be very careful about how well have these been documented. That will be a very important governance aspect which one has to consider. If not considered, is going to be a significant risk. How are we going to have these covered as a risk management protocols? These are aspects which I think, the learnings which have been, I would be tempted to say could be siloed or singular. How do we get this across the entire organizational culture? That's going to be one of the other important things which is going to be pervasive as a theme with respect of the audits you do. Thanks, Tinku.
Yeah, very well said, Sunil. That's a good point that you brought it out. Yes, Sunil. We'll move to the next slide. I think you are going to cover this. Over to you, Sunil.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Tinku. Thank you for the insights, Tinku. So what we're going to do in the next couple of slides is discuss around the risk assessment, which Tinku touched upon as part of the planning activity. Now, let me just give you an example. In the past, when we go back to 5 to 10 years back, or maybe a little earlier, risk assessment has been a common subject. Dynamic risk assessment has been a common terminology, but the frequency of the dynamic risk assessment or a risk assessment cycle has been either yearly or something which as and when it was needed, but not of a regular frequency. Today, with the changes which have had upon based on the pandemic and based on so many changes in the technological inputs which have happened, we're seeing organization mature and those which are in the high on the maturity curve and gradually going towards the maturity curve make this dynamic risk assessment cycles a little more frequent, as much as quarterly, whether it is geographical discussions with the business leads, based on discussions with the COOs, auditees, all these inputs are taken in, and then based on that, the audit risk assessment cycle is becoming more and more dynamic. That is something which one has to factor in before they get into an impactful and effective planning. The second part of it, which is covered here, is in addition to the frequency, I would like to focus on the qualitative, on the quantitative aspects. For us, it's not new when we go to an auditee unit to say that, hey, I have so many things, and in addition to that, you guys have come for an audit. Now, that's not new at all, and that's not something which the auditees love to say. It is just that they have so much on the plate. What happens typically, more often than not, we see that information delays, forced closure of audits, not having value-based audits, and then we would just land up with trying to attend to the maximum, but sometimes may not be able to justify. That gets us to the plan as a very important aspect where we don't need to sympathize with the problems, but we need to understand the timing of it would be very important to accommodate, but to be ensuring that we give a positive assurance to the management of the company, the stakeholders of the company, but also give those qualitative inputs, ensuring that these parameters are very well covered right in the planning perspective, keeping in mind the year ends, regulatory changes, seasonal ups and downs, compliance requirements, and things like these. I think those have to be very well baked up in the audit plans, followed by the audit programs and the fieldwork executions. The next is taking inputs. A lot of times it is expected, well, it is not implemented always, is the management auditors or the internal auditors tend to work in silos and really do not consult their external auditors. Now, what happens is inputs from the external auditors and other stakeholders makes it very important to try and focus on the emphasis areas. These emphasis areas could be something where through the external audit guidelines and through their own channels, they may have focus areas where they would have knowledge repositories, or they would have their own points of view where they could request the internal auditors to try and focus a little more on. So these are the factors which one has to consider in planning. In addition to that, it is interesting that a lot of planning literature is there around a lot of companies. Now, if you go back to the drawing boards and go back to the fact there is a lot of literature in a lot of companies, but however, many of the times it is seen that those are archived and kept and really not pulled up and read. So it is very important to match the theory and the practice, to go back to the drawing board, to go back and relook at the planning from, I would be tempted to say, from a zero-based planning, very similar to a zero-based budgeting, a zero-based planning. Looking at it and drawing it up, saying that, hey, let's look at what went well last time. How can we refine it rather than making it as a plain vanilla planning activity, adding dynamism, adding chocolate chips to it, and ensuring that the tools and technology are all very well covered, including the data science and the data analytics requirements. Next is on the tool. Now, whether we call it a tool, whether we call it technology, but conceptually, where one should ideally be heading in is, we all speak about sample-based audits. Typically for a IFC or a SOX, we say that, hey, if it is a regular transaction-based audits, I think, if it's a high-risk kind of a control, we should be taking in 40 or 50 samples. Imagine a scenario where we're running a tool, and which is quite common nowadays, that instead of doing a sample-based audit, we actually factor in, and we do that in our planning itself, that we will run a particular tool which will have 100% covered for that set period of audit, and then which throws up the exceptions. All the field team has to do when they go onto the ground is to look at those exceptions and then wipe out the false positives. So they will have to look at whether really the data is correct, whether the data is thrown up certain exceptions and things like these. So that is very important. And then that's where I think a planning engagement needs to have factoring of the tools and the technology to the best possible extent. Coming to the next, while we talk about, once all these are discussed and planned about, we talk about freezing the plan. The freezing the plan is to ensure that the plan is frozen for a set of audits in the entity geographically, or based on regulations, or based on requirements of the business units. But we also need to be keeping in mind, the most effective is to have a rolling plan, a 12-month rolling plan, 15-month or an 18-month rolling plan. What we are going to cover in this quarter, what we're going to cover in the next quarter, and how will that go on, and that dynamism needs to come in. Freezing is important to ensure that we lock the right kind of resources, have a very agile audit kind of methodology, having focused and periodic audits with a specific time frame and outputs. But it's important to keep the dynamism, if required, defer certain audits, if required, advance certain audits, and if required, also ensure that we meet the business requirements due to changing scenarios and circumstances. Of course, based on all these, once this entire thing is locked, the risk assessments plans are submitted to the audit committee, we take the feedback, and then the sequence goes on. I would say that while there is a sequence to it, there is also a huge amount of dynamism, huge amount of changes, and huge amount of, say, the intuition of the consulting brains coming in along with the business to ensure that everybody works in tandem and makes it very, very impactful and an interesting audit engagement exercise. With that said, let me take a few minutes about.
Sorry, Sunil.
Yes,
Sunil, I would like to add to this. So just to bring in a practical perspective. So we as a company were used to have an annual plan, which is kind of annual affair, which we used to drop at the beginning of the year, and we used to follow up for the whole of the rest of the year. But from this year onward, we have also moved to the concept of this dynamic risk plan, audit risk plan. So we have drawn up a plan, which would be, we have also agreed with the board that we will have a quarterly kind of audit plan. And we will do the assessment at the beginning of each quarter, and based on the risk assessment at the quarter end, then we'll be conducting the review. Just to bring in this perspective in our company, how we have adopted this.
Excellent. Thank you so much for sharing that. So
can I add a sentence?
Yes, sir.
At this point, it's important that you do not confuse the annual audit planning cycle with your engagement planning, which we are dealing with right now. What is being stressed is that during the engagement planning, the risk assessment you do has to always relate to a dynamic risk assessment planning cycle which the organization follows, so that your risk assessment, your independent risk assessment of the activity being audited is current and up to date. So I just wanted to bring in this differentiation between this audit planning in general and engagement planning in particular. Thank you. That's
Excellent, sir. Thank you so much. Moving on, I would just like to give some examples. We spoke about certain tools, methods, technology, aids, and all this which help in doing a risk assessment and making it dynamic, and how this can be factored into our planning, whether as an engagement plan or whether as an overall audit plan for the year. Let me take two examples. I know it is a busy slide, but I would like to focus on two aspects which are there on the left here. One is a typical emerging risk report. Some of the clients where we are looking at, and there's an hospitality client, and we've seen a very good example coming in from them, where they have a mention of a monthly risk report which is actually shared with their business group, including the C-suite. So typically, the emerging risk report actually talks about how they perceive a risk in their geography, in their area of operation, in their country of operation, and whether it is whichever type of the property they are, whether they are a business property, whether they are a luxury property, or whether they are a typical kind of a vacation property or a leisure property. Now, when they look at it, and they have actually seen a trend which is coming in, and they've called it, it's an interesting trend. Some of you may have heard this. It's called revenge tourism, which means that the people who have felt the lockdown has taken a toll on them, a lot of them have decided to move out and with precaution, with care, go out and enjoy their holidays in the Christmas and the New Year. They've seen a spurt in the hotel bookings to an extent that some of the very, very exotic locations are totally sold out now, in spite of the fact that people are aware of the wave 2, wave 3, and others which are coming in. Now, with that said, they have talking about giving instructions to the staff of how carefully to manage so that they don't have reputational impact with crowd gathering together in one places, or in a typical beach resort kind of a place, how to carefully manage the crowd, ensure that there's no reputation risk, be careful about their swimming pools, not to open them, and how to manage the entire scenario, because they have had bad business. They'll be very keen to reopen their business and get some revenues. However, just ensuring that they do that in a balance. So that's been one thing where, a emerging risk, a risk which is going to come in future. How do you really plan for that, and how do you actually do that? So in that context, it actually talks about being a little proactive and say that, have we given the respective guidelines? Are the Ministry of Health Affairs guidelines being given and circulated to them for that respective countries? Are they aware? Are they trained? Are they well planned to equip and handle themselves for the upcoming spurt in their business activity? So always, these are the things which make it really dynamic. And then that is where it is very important to factor those, and then maybe make it more of an agile kind of a planning scenario, rather than have it as a post-mortem scenario. Same is the case even when you look at the tools and technologies at the bottom where we have mentioned as a web crawler. Let's take a very, very simple example of a very well-known bank, State Bank of India, which needs no introduction. And this is purely hypothetical example from an academic purpose. Now, if somebody has to take this, the humongous size of this organization is such that regulations, to keep up with the regulations for a bank of this enormous stature and size, they're multi-geography, they're in different countries, and various laws are applicable to them, starting from the banking regulations, HR, labor laws, and so on and so forth, and so many others. If the management wants a assurance that they are complied with all the necessary aspects from a compliance standpoint of view, statutory compliance standpoint of view, regulatory compliance standpoint of view, it is humanly impossible to ensure that all these are a positive tick mark. Now, that's where typically what we have seen in organizations, and we have seen them do this, is we have helped them develop a web crawler. Now, imagine a crawler which gets on to a particular website which has got a permission to access, and keywords are searched upon, like for example, a Basel norms which are changed. Say for example, any other regulatory changes which have come. These keywords get highlighted. The web is crawled by this particular bot, enabled in such a way that all the changes along with the date and the time are actually put in, and then summarized in form of a report and shared with the respective auditees or shared with the respective management auditors, so that they know what are the changes which have happened, based on which they can go and make an impactful check on where all the changes have happened and whether the auditee is well equipped to handle this. So it's important to bake in the planning cycle of how well a tool and technology can be used, and these become a precursor sometimes to have and very, very effective and objective audit. With that said, I would like to focus on a couple of other areas which are more of an emerging risk trend and more of I would say they all can be planned in our respective audit planning activities, whether we are doing a procurement audit, HR audit, whether we are doing a safety audit, or we are doing an overall enterprise risk management kind of an audit. So for each of this context, there may be separate ways to deal with it, but without going thematically, I'll make it in general. Now, in terms of the emerging risks, we've seen that a lot of times the business have come back to us and given us about certain early warning signals of a typical emerging risk. Now, what they've said is some of them have asked us that, when we welcome the employees back, we'll have to be careful about how they would want to come back and, whether we can let them in, while the ministry has given guidelines, whether it's important to have only people who have got vaccines to come in. How do we try and do that? I think we need to have this as a very clear mandate. So to that extent, a lot of safety policies and HR policies will need to undergo a change. On the strategic side, I'll give one other example, which we have found it extremely uh, super important, but then it is a very, very basic thing, is a lot of organizations have been involved in CSR activities, corporate social responsibility activities. Now, if you look at it, a lot of organizations have either taken the step of done it themselves through having a program or contributed to the typical PM relief fund or the authorized activities. Now, for organizations which have actually had a corporate social responsibility and done certain meals to be given, camps to be run, health camps or others, it is very important for them now under the new scenario to be very careful to not have people conglomerate into one place or accumulate into one place and perform this activity. Strategically, from a planning perspective, it is important to call and look at these activities of how would one want to treat their CSR. How would they want to be careful so that they don't run into a reputational risk that they have been actually a reason why this entire thing has spread. So one has to go back and start looking at it and then look at the balance between being impactful, doing their CSR activities, but be strategic enough to see that they are not caught on the wrong foot for a good work they've done. Similarly, when I go from a scope perspective, I look at it, well, the scope can be thematic. It can be a typical procurement audit, or it could be a typical, say, IFC audit. But what's important to look at, and Tinku touched upon this briefly, is around not sticking to it, but having a limitation of what to do and what not to do and how to ring fence the scope. It's important to look at it that, sometimes the culture drives a lot of conversations, and that is important to factor in a planning activity. Let us take a procurement kind of an audit typically. We have seen organizations who have not had a great job rotation policy. It is there on paper but not implemented. And in the procurement function, you have people who continue for more than 2 decades, 3 decades, or maybe sometimes start there and retire there. Well, these are certain things which I think is very important to go back to the audit planning directly and not just stick to the procurement function audit, to actually see whether it ties up to the organizational policies. And that's where it's quite important to go back to the drawing boards and revisit the planning. While it may sound a little monotonous year on year as a planning, but it's always there is a scope for a further refinement and further improvement. And these are all certain things which is just trying to tie up the various aspects. Similarly, even when we look at a typical attrition, certain organizations, we find that every year we land up having interactions with new set of people. Now that actually talks about how is that related to planning. Now that's important because one needs to be careful about the fact that the changes potentially would have new people coming in can give new insights. Similarly, new people coming in always could also have a, a small indication of a deteriorating risk culture where maybe there's too much of a pressure, and the undercurrents of which have to be understood from a softer aspects and not just touch upon of how to conduct the typical audit and perform the planning. So some of these can be planned well in advance and then seen on whether these are all false positives or really whether they have an impact. Moving on from a value-based work, so most of the work from a planning perspective is not about tick the box. Now we have gone to a stage where it's a high value-based engagements. The use of bots, the use of RPAs, identifying areas where they can be where the processes can be automated, where the reconciliation activities need not be manual and the bank reconciliation can be totally bot driven and automated, trying to have enhanced kind of conversations around automation. Now, when there is an automation, it is very important from a planning perspective to occasionally check, to audit the bot, to check the bot libraries. Certain organizations have had very sophisticated environments, have got very sophisticated functions, have had very sophisticated automations already in place. Now, while there is a bot, it's great to actually sometimes relook at it and audit the bot, audit the logic, how it is going in. Because typically from an automation standpoint of view, it's given in great benefits, but one from a planning perspective and going back and tying it back to see whether we have the right resource to technically challenge the script or the code or what has been written is also very, very important. So that's again, while automation has happened, is to actually challenge the automation in the right manner. Similarly, when you go on to the next one, which is around the communication, we would have all seen, and in fact, there is a very noted survey which has been run by our organization, and we've seen that a lot of emails which are junk emails or phishing emails have been answered. They should have never been touched upon. They should have been reported. But since people have now access to emails more often, people are there sitting and working from home and working in their environments and not really in a factory setup or in their office setup. They have had more and more an access towards the respective emails and others where they have landed up with touching on emails which were never supposed to be opened. That gets us to a point about excessive communication. You would have seen that ever since the lockdown has started and then resumed, when the activities are a little slow and slowly picking up, there's a humongous amount of communication. Oral, written, WhatsApp, LinkedIn, every form of social media platform, or an email platform. Now, because of that, it's very important from a planning perspective to have certain protocols and set up that, in your regular status updates or how you would be planning, the communication could be crisp, to the point, frequency based, very, very, very impactful to ensure that nothing slips through the cracks. Otherwise, one could land up into a situation where very high important activities, especially for global organizations, if they're not vigilant enough about their communication, certain major slip ups could potentially happen. Now, with that said, I would not want to talk too much around the pandemic, but I would like to make a mention about these couple of pervasive themes which we have seen. In future, with whatever has happened now, but in future, one has to carve out for every audit, whether any thematic audit, whether we are talking about health and safety and environment audits, whether it's a HR procurement audit, there is going to be a play of technology. The technology can form part of connections through portals, virtual private networks or VPNs, Zooms and the WebEx and the Teams, in every form and shape where potentially the data could be compromised. There could be cyber attacks. There could be every form where SOD controls related access related issues. All of these, it make it very important for us to have a very laser focused embedded cyber/IT audits ingrained into each of these functional audit areas. And those need to be planned in the audit in each module. Well, the framework for each of the organizations, the way they want to approach this could be different, but it would be very a good change to consider this at a function level, and for each function having IT end-to-end address this as part of the original planning. Similarly, from a return to work basis, that we've seen that there could be organizations which have had a huge amounts of learning, but when they're having these huge amounts of learning, how are they going to implement this new learning? Are they ready? If we ask them, are they ready really with, if there is another pandemic, would they be able to show their learnings in such a way that this learning curve which they have gone in, they'll be able to implement? Have they relooked at their insurance as they come up for the insurance renewals whenever it is happening for each of the organizations? Are they covering them appropriately? Considering what has gone through, are they really looking at it in the right manner? Not just for themselves, also for their vendor partners, also for their visitors. Are they asking the right questions that, when the visitors or the others come in, auditors come in, vendors come in, are their organizations ensuring that people who are coming in are being well taken care of by them? Also, from a perspective of the various procedures and the HR policies, are they really having all those ramped up and they know what to do? Are they having the safety officers? Are they planned very well? Have they conducted the safety audits? And all these should form part of their respective planning activities in direct forms or indirect forms. but it's important for everybody to touch upon these aspects as well. Now, some of these have been covered. I'll just be additive and just want to emphasize on certain key aspects. Now, from a assess and define perspective, what's very important is to look at the metrics which matter the most. So defining additional evaluation matrices are very important for the existing planning, typically to see whether the HSE audits have been conducted, whether the before the people come from a work from home perspective to a full normal perspective, are there everything which has been taken care of? Are there pre-audits which are done from a HSE perspective? Similarly, from the planning and designing perspective, it's important to see whether the external inputs have been factored on. It's not all in-house, whether really all the external inputs have been taken in, the cyber, the forensics, and others for each of the areas, and whether the planning has actually implemented the right kind of subject matter experts. Similarly, from the implementation and the sustained perspective, whether really all the regulations have been up to date and taken care of. How are these impacting the planning? We have the new HR labor reforms coming in and the labor laws coming in. Whenever they hit, are we prepared? Are we having a reg compliance tool? Are we having things which can be tracked easily? And how do we actually dovetail into the overall audit planning activities? While we touched upon the communication, it's important while we spoke about the communication being very crisp and precise, the FOMO concept which is picked up, the fear of missing out, ensuring that nothing is missed out from an important communication perspective. Everything is actually, there's not an overkill around communication, but it's very important to get the right side of communication, including those which are like ethics and integrity hotline. A lot of people who have gone into a factory mode, gone away from the factory mode, or gone away from the workplace home, from an ethics and integrity and hotline perspective, it is important to check whether all these are up and running, because slowly when people resume, it's going to be important to have all these. And even now, not to undermine the fact that even from a typical work from home or work from remote environment, that whether these communication channels, not just from employee to employee, but overall, the overall business communication is effective, running, and engaged at every point of view to ensure that it's a 360-degree completeness. So with that said, I'll hand it over back to Tinku. Tinku, over to you, please.
Thank you, Sunil. Thanks very much. So these slides provides us a bird's eye view of universe of all the standards related to planning and some correlation between the IIS standards on managing the internal activity, which is a 2000 series, and IIS standard 2200 series, which provides us a guidance on audit engagement planning. So for example, that standard 2000 says that CAE to manage the IA activity to add the value to the organization, and standard 2010 talks about the risk-based audit plan to be prepared to establish the priorities of IA. In correlation, the standard 2200 says engagement plan must be developed to establish the priorities of audit engagement. Second step in the audit planning is to gathering information to understand the business process which is required in engagement planning as per standard 2200 and also in standard 2010 while preparing a risk-based audit plan. Similarly, while preparing the risk-based audit plan in 2010, you take into account the expectations, the input of the stakeholders, documented risk assessment, and the plan must be aligned with the goals and strategies of the company. A similar approach we follow in standard 2200 while you draw up your engagement plan, where you take into account the key focus areas based on the plan risk assessment, expertise on stakeholders, the goals and objectives of the activity being audited. As per standard 2030, CAE to ensure that appropriate and sufficient deployment of resources to achieve the audit plan. As discussed earlier, a similar guidance is provided while conducting engagement planning, which requires us to an appropriate and sufficient resources to achieve the engagement objective. So this gives us a overall perspective, all the applicable standard related to audit planning also, as well as preparation of annual audit plan. Sunil, you would like to add something here?
No, I think Tinku, you have covered it very well, and the whole perspective here, as just Tinku mentioned, is to cover for people who are not used to looking at the sheets in terms of going back to the theory. is to look at it and then revisit the very rich literature IIA has got and relook at some of these standards while you're doing your activities and not jump. The temptation to jump into a routine activity is very high. So I would encourage all of us to relook at this and then start looking at a planning with an altogether new dimension, taking in the technology and other aspects which we have spoken about. So with that said, Tinku, in case you have any other points to discuss, we could. Mr. Menon, you want to add something, please do. Otherwise, we'd be more than happy to take questions from the participants.
No, sorry, I am done, and we are happy to take
I don't have anything further, Sunil and Tinku. You have covered all the essential aspects pretty well. Now, can I ask Manas to please read out the questions?
Yeah, so we have a question from Puneet Dudeja. He's asking if we can discuss some more sample planning documents.
Sure. So I can take that question. Yeah, definitely. In the interest of time, this is a vast subject, so we just wanted to cover and touch upon various things in a very short manner. But we can take this offline, and we'd be more than happy to discuss this into a very rich conversation for us, all of us. So we'd be happy doing that.
Just to add, Sunil, I'll add something, Sunil, to that. So, as Puneet mentioned, a sample, audit document. So, the best I can share and connect with him is the planning document which we use in our Dr. Reddy's. As I was mentioning earlier, it's a must for any engagement to start with, which has all the important ingredients like in terms of audit scope, the key process owners, who is the reviewer, what are the key risks, what are the key aspects of program which we are going to cover, what are the key inputs which we have while interacting with the stakeholders. So all these focus areas, and also to that we add a background of the audit activity which we are going to cover. Say for example, a business which we are going to review, or a process which you are going to review. We add a background, also some aspects of a fraud risk. So what are the key fraud risks in that area which you are going to audit it? Because an auditor need to be aware of that and also take into account while auditing the whole activity. So that is a comprehensive document which you prepare. Maybe I'll connect with him offline and I can have a discussion with him.
Sure, sir.
Over to you,
Moving to the next question, yeah, it's from Mr. Vikram Vij, which is while doing a risk assessment, should we also focus on fast-moving risk, which are like very low at present?
I would like to take that question, and Menon sir and Tinku, feel free to add. Yes, sir, that's a very good question, and I would encourage you to do that. As part of a typical risk assessment, I would encourage you to relook at the risk which you may have called a low risk or a low priority risk or a non-key risk. To relook at the current year, it may still retain the same stature of a low risk. If that is the case, it's fine. But if it is not, then it's going to be a very, very revealing risk assessment exercise for you on relooking at from a zero-based approach. I would encourage you strictly to do that.
Just to add to what Sunil said, Sunil gave a detailed account of dynamic risk assessment. So this is a key to the dynamic risk assessment because you keep your risk evaluation alive and current, and that is when a low risk today could turn out to be a medium or high risk tomorrow. Like this pandemic we are seeing, nobody would have imagined last year that the likelihood of pandemic nobody would have rated it high. It would have been a low probability risk last year, but now how things have changed. So what I'm saying is that I mean, as you do a dynamic risk assessment, you get a fresh update on the risk profile of a particular activity or a particular business unit. That's all. Thank you.
Okay, so there's one more question from Azam Ali, which is audit plan for 3 years is advisable or only 1 year is sufficient?
Azim, I mean, this depends on the organizational maturity. Sorry, go ahead, Menos. Go ahead, please.
Yeah, I thought you didn't get the question, so I was trying to repeat it. So you can go ahead.
No, I think that's great. Thank you, Menos. So, Azim, I would rate it with the organization's maturity. Currently, we have been involved with two very big global organizations where they have given their audit planning. One is for 18 months, other is for 2 years. So I think going beyond a year, there is a merit to it. And the reason why there is a merit to it is to ensure that some of these very humongous global organizations don't need to cover. There's a cost for an audit, cost for the compliance as well, without compromising anything, but there's still a cost to it. So there are certain aspects which don't have to be done repeatedly year on year. They can be done once in 2 years. So from that perspective, it will become very important into when you bucket your overall audits and then see thematic audits. Some can be done, say maybe once in 2 years. Some can be done 6 months, and to stagger that. So I would encourage you to have it in a 2 to 3 year time frame. There is nothing which calls for that you will have to do it every year. However, please note the difference. You will have to revisit this and see that what has to be advanced. You may have a 2 year plan, but you may want to advance certain audits and then keep on looking at it from a dynamic perspective.
Just to
Let me add to
Sunil,
that. Let me add to that. I used to work with the United Nations. We had a system of having a rolling medium-term audit plan. What happens is that you have a firm audit plan for the current year and a rolling plan for the next 2 years. At the end of the current year, you have a relook at the next 2 years and then make necessary adjustments as required depending on the current level of risk profile of the auditing units you're proposing to audit, and then add a third year also depending on the your current assessment. So it would be, I would even go to the extent of recommending a 3-year medium term rolling plan cycle.
right. So just to add what Sunil and Mehan sir added, so I also just want to add this perspective that you need to be cognizant of the fact of changing business environment and technological advancement, and what are the risks emerging out of that. So you have a good 3-year medium-term plan, but do take into account on a periodic basis these factors to ensure that we are not leaving out any key risk or important emerging risk while conducting the reviews. That's it. Thank you. Over to you, Menas.
Yes, sir. We have Sarvanand asking if we can explain the role of internal auditor in ERM before strategic decision making with any case study or illustration, if possible.
Sorry, Mehnaz, I
Yeah,
kind
I'll
of did
repeat,
not.
sir.
Yeah.
Yeah, it is like this question is from Mr. Sarvanando. He
Okay.
would like to know the role of internal auditor in ERM before strategic making, decision making with any case study.
Do you want me to take the question, Sunil?
Yes, please. Yes, please, sir.
Yes, Menas, sorry, go ahead.
Okay. See, the internal audit is responsible to give assurance to the stakeholders that there is a ERM framework which is working and which is working satisfactorily. So there is an onus on the internal audit to assess the ERM framework within the organization on an ongoing basis. I don't know whether all the organizations do that, but most of the organizations which I've come across, they have a separate item called ERM audit, which is either an annual audit or a biannual audit. So once that ERM framework is assessed and necessary assurance drawn, the internal audit also makes internal risk assessment, because eventually the audit planning is done on the basis of the internal audit's own risk assessment, not totally relying upon the ERM framework or the management's risk assessment of the activity or the organization as a whole. So the internal audit has a very positive and active role to play in the ERM framework, not only auditing ERM as an auditable activity, but also in every engagement which is carried out. What they do is that they draw on the risk assessment of the particular audited activity or the business unit, as well as make their own internal risk assessment based on the information gathered through the preliminary survey. Hope I have answered your question. If you have any more questions, you can ask.
Minan sir, I want to add to that. What you mentioned, you gave a very good account of that. I just want to draw this reference from the standards. So it says that, the chief audit executive has to obtain an understanding from the senior management and the board what is the expectation of internal audit with activity with regard to the risk management. So that has to be very clearly defined in the audit charter. What is the role of IE they are expecting with respect to the organization's risk management? So it can be four things. So first, they can expect the internal audit they don't want any role to be played by the IA. Secondly, internal auditor can be when I'm saying internal auditor, it's an internal audit activity or a function. So they can do an audit of the risk management process as a part of internal audit plan, which Minister was referring. Thirdly, they can act as a continuous support involvement in the risk management process by way of participating in the oversight committee or monitoring activities or status reporting. Or fourth one, managing and coordinating the whole risk management process. That's it. Just wanted to add this. Thank you.
Okay, sir, we have the next question from Mr. Azam Ali again. He needs to know, in case if we need to extend the scope of audit, how are we going to justify the time and resources?
Well, Mr. Azam, I'll tell you, yes, there is always going to be a push for the resources and there's always going to be a budget constraint. But when you do a very robust planning exercise and then do this assessment of which is a high priority item, and they are able to convince to the board of why this is the most risk-based items that need to be attended to, then I think automatically things will fall in place. I know it is not an easy battle sometimes, but it's extremely important to have these conversations put in a right perspective and share with the board, who will then appreciate and then will be able to help the company better. But yes, it is a challenging exercise sometimes.
And also, Sunil, the audit scope, as I mentioned earlier, it should meet the audit objective. So when our objective is to evaluate the internal controls, or to comment whether my policies are adhering to the the process are adhering to the policies, but I am not able to comment on that, then I need to justify that and increase the scope. So ideally the way the audit plan should be, I was listening to one of the speakers, renowned speaker. So he was mentioning, just saying this perspective, that ideally the audit plan, the whole audit plan should have the number of audits should be more, and the audit scope should be less, so that the team can go in depth, look at the critical areas, and comment on that. So audit scope should be limited, focus on the key areas, key risks, and then comment on that. So if you want to increase the scope, as Sunil was mentioning, if justifiable, the key risks are not covered, high risk areas not covered, then it needs to be increased. That's it from my side.
Okay,
normally
so
the scope, the need for the scope change happens during an audit when some of the findings may warrant expanding the scope of the audit. So we have to bear that also in mind.
Absolutely. Well said.
Okay, so before the next question, sir, we have Mr. Narayanan R thanking you for the succinct presentation. And just to let you know, he was very excited to attend this presentation of yours, since he's been marketing this internally to his colleagues, and probably he's joining with his team today. So we'll just
thank you very much. Really appreciate. Really appreciate.
Yeah.
We are thank you.
Yeah, so he was quite excited for many days. He was like trying to market this internally to his team, and he's probably joining with his team today. So we have a question from him. From your experience, do you see traction of application on Indian standards on planning addition to IA standards?
Aaron sir, you would like to answer this?
I'm not very familiar with the Indian standards because I've mostly been, worked in international environment. So I think Sunil or Tinku can.
Yeah, so a similar experience with me. That's why I was trying to push you. Because yeah, go ahead, Sunil. You want to?
No, very honestly, that's a very good question. So I think we are all blindsided to it. Let me make that. I think it's important to see that globally, we've seen how the IFRS has got baked into the typical Indian audit standards. I would take that as an example. So global family has got the standardization across standards, and I would assume that's the way we are going to take. But I have not seen or had any insights around it.
Yes, I will just say that perspective because I have gone through this international standards, IA standards, while clearing the certified internal auditor. Though some part of it were covered during the CA curriculum, but still, what I understand, this Indian auditing standards have also been drawn leaf out of the international standards. But to be very honest, not familiar with the Indian auditing standards, honestly.
Next question, sir.
Yes, please go ahead, Manas.
Yeah. Okay, the next question is from Mr. Satish Shenoy. So he's asking, at times a few audits take longer than anticipated for many reasons, which impact team availability of team members, which is a good practice to handle this.
I can take that questions, and we run into this very often. So one is to, okay, let me put it in a very uh, direct manner. One is to hard close this, because you will not ever have the team members always waiting for the information. You'll have to hard close it. And with the writer that we were able to do only so much, and this has to be taken up next time. That's the reason why people have come up with agile audit and with different words, scrum based and other things and all. The whole purpose is to actually have a defined 2 week, 3 week, 4 week short burst period to say that first you give me this information, only then will I come to you, only then will I audit and have my team members locked in. You have to pay by that particular hour or whatever, so that there are overall stakes high. It calls for a very dedicated planning and agreement on the timelines between the auditor and the auditee, with no excuses unless there is an emergency. So that's the kind of a trend setting or then expectation setting I would encourage you that you do with your clients or with your team members right upfront, and get that in a formal sign off. That will get more time efficiency at stake.
It's a very interesting question, Satish ji. Thank you for asking it. I hope you are satisfied with Sunil's answer.
Thank you, Satish sir. Thank you very much.
Okay, so we have the next question from Mr. Chandra Prakash Parekh. He's asking, further to your experience, what is the time frame typically which takes to plan an audit?
So generally,
Go ahead, Tinku. Sorry.
go ahead, Sunil. So generally, how we do is that, say, for example, an engagement is planned for a 3 to 4 week, 4 week, the whole engagement. We spend at least 1 week in the planning part. So that is a very critical part. So we spend a considerable time there deliberating the whole scope, processes, understanding with the stakeholders, meeting with them, so that once that foundation is built on, then the field work and the other activities would follow on. So we spend good amount of time. At least 25% of time is spent on the planning part. Anything,
Right. So we
Sunil?
have,
Yeah, go ahead.
yeah.
Sunil.
Uh, okay, sir. So we have the next question, sir, from Mr. Samarth Chauhan. He's asking how to cope up with the audit plan which could not be completed due to the lack of resources due to the pandemic. And there is a next part to this question, which is in how to change the upcoming plan based on the constraints.
The first part of it calls for a bigger concern to me. I think your question is very valid, and that's what a lot of organizations have gone in, and that is where it calls for preparedness. Meaning, if we are not prepared to do a remote environment and we have the disaster recoveries and business continuities and work from home and business as usual as all certified and done, it actually calls to go back to that and question that, saying that if we had a digitized basis on which things could have been done, then I think, either those initial initiatives we have taken have not taken shape properly, or it's time not to look at it at this point from an audit completion perspective, but actually let's get back to those drawing boards and see that tomorrow, if something like this happens, we don't get again stuck midway. I think the focus then would have to change rather than completion to get the digital infrastructure straight first. I would start from there. However, yes, if you've not had a chance to complete something and then you would have to complete that, sometimes due to regulations. So we've had scenarios where immediately after the lockdown, the organizations have started with limited workforce, and then that's the best way that we can organize and manage, which would be your call based on the engagement and client priorities.
I'm afraid we are running short of time. I suggest we take just 1 or 2 questions more, and the remaining questions will be answered offline. Is it okay, Menas?
Yes, sir, we are done with the questions. We just have a thank you note from Mr. Azam Ali and Mr. Satish Shenoy. We are done with the questions, sir.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you very
sir.
much. Thanks very much.
Yeah.
Thank
Thanks,
you very
Satish.
much. And shall we close before winding up? Let me thank all the attendees in this meeting, in the webinar, and for their very brain steering questions they posed. I'm sure this session was of great benefit to you all, and looking forward to further sessions with you. Thank you very much, and wonderful job, Sunil and Tinku and IAA India, Menas, for all your support. Thank you, and have a good evening.
Welcome, sir.
Thank you to all the participants.
Thank you.
Thank you, Menas.
Yeah.
Bye.
Thank you,
Thank
Menon,
you.
sir.
Bye.
Thank you, IA India. Thank you for providing the opportunity to share our knowledge on this platform. Really appreciate. Thank you very much for all your support and guidance. Thank you.